We have seen the blue marble before. The photograph taken by the Apollo 17 crew in December 1972 became one of the most reproduced images in human history within months of its release. It appeared on magazine covers and protest signs and the walls of classrooms on every continent. It changed the environmental movement. It changed the way human beings understood their relationship to the planet they lived on. It did all of that because of what it showed, a complete, fully illuminated Earth suspended in absolute black, blue and white and brown, detailed enough to see continents and cloud systems and the curvature of the atmosphere, close enough that the planet still looked large and present and real. That photograph was taken from a distance of approximately 45,000 kilometers, far enough to see the whole Earth, close enough that the whole Earth still looked like a world. The Artemis II crew took their photographs of Earth from a distance of 450,000 kilometers, 10 times farther, and what they saw through the windows of the Orion capsule was not the blue marble. It was something that does not have a name yet in any language, because no human being had ever seen it from that distance before, and the psychological research on what it does to the human mind is only now beginning to catch up to what the astronauts who experienced it have been trying to describe for 50 years. NASA released the official images from the Artemis II Earth observation sessions with the language that NASA uses for official image releases: historic, stunning, inspiring, a new perspective on our home planet. The press release was accurate in every technical sense, and it communicated almost nothing about what the images actually represent as a psychological document, because these images were not taken by a camera mounted on a probe or a satellite or an instrument package designed to produce scientifically calibrated data about Earth's atmospheric systems. They were taken by 4 human beings who had been living inside a pressurized capsule for the better part of a week, whose bodies had been accumulating radiation exposure and cardiovascular deconditioning and sleep disruption and the sustained low-level stress of operating in an environment that requires constant vigilance to survive, and who looked out of their windows at the object they could see in the direction of home and saw something that the word Earth does not adequately describe at that distance. They saw a pixel, a blue pixel, bright against the black, recognizable in the way that a candle is recognizable across a very large dark room, present and real, and unreachable in any time frame that emergency response operates within. The official images show Earth. What the crew experienced looking at those images in real time, in their bodies, in their nervous systems, is documented in 50 years of astronaut psychology research, and it is considerably more disturbing than any fabricated anomaly in the cloud formations. The overview effect is a term coined by the writer Frank White in 1987 to describe the cognitive shift reported consistently by astronauts who see the Earth from space for the first time. White interviewed astronauts extensively and found a pattern in their descriptions that transcended individual personality and mission type. The experience of seeing the Earth as a complete object suspended in space, without borders, without the divisions that structure human political and social life, produced a shift in perspective that the astronauts described as instant, involuntary, and permanent. They described feeling a sudden and overwhelming sense of the planet's fragility, a visceral understanding of the thinness of the atmosphere as a protective layer, a cognitive reorganization of their relationship to other human beings, to political conflicts, to the things they had considered important before the moment of seeing the whole Earth at once. The overview effect, as White documented it, was primarily described as positive, expansive, a broadening of perspective that most astronauts reported as one of the most significant experiences of their lives. But White's research was conducted primarily with astronauts who experienced Earth from low Earth orbit, from the International Space Station at 400 kilometers altitude, from the shuttle missions that rarely exceeded 600 kilometers. At those distances, the Earth is not a pixel. It is a landscape. It fills a significant portion of the visual field. The details of continents and ocean color and weather systems are visible to the naked eye. The cognitive connection between the object in the window and the home that it represents remains intact because the object still looks like a home. At 450,000 kilometers, the cognitive connection breaks. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological description of what happens when the visual system receives information that the brain's prior models cannot adequately process. The human visual cortex evolved over millions of years to process information about an environment where Earth was not an object that could be seen, but the surface you were standing on. The idea of Earth as a distinct object with a boundary and a position in space is an abstraction that the intellectual mind can process, but that the emotional and instinctual systems of the brain have no evolutionary preparation for. When an astronaut in low Earth orbit looks at the Earth, they are seeing something their intellect tells them is the whole planet, but their visual system processes as a very large curved landscape, something that the brain can map onto familiar categories of experience, even imperfectly. When an astronaut at lunar distance looks at the Earth, they are seeing something that is visually indistinguishable from a bright star, a point of light. Their intellectual knowledge that this point of light contains every person they have ever known and every place they have ever been is processed by the cognitive systems. Their visual and emotional systems receive a point of light, the gap between those two simultaneous experiences, knowing intellectually what you were looking at while your sensory systems report something that looks like a star, is where the psychological research gets complicated. The astronaut Ron Garan, who spent 178 days on the International Space Station, described the overview effect in a book as a tragic beauty, simultaneously the most beautiful thing he had ever seen and a source of profound sadness at the realization of how fragile the planet appeared and how indifferently the universe surrounded it. Garan was in low Earth orbit, where Earth still filled most of his window. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14 and therefore saw Earth from the distance that the Artemis II crew experienced, described something more extreme. He described a sudden and overwhelming sense of the universe as a conscious and intelligent system, and of his own understanding of reality as fundamentally inadequate to the experience he was having. Mitchell spent the rest of his life trying to find frameworks adequate to describe what looking at Earth from lunar distance had done to his understanding of his own existence. He was not describing inspiration. He was describing a cognitive event for which no prior category of human experience provided adequate preparation. The psychological research literature on what Edgar Mitchell described and what other lunar astronauts have reported in various forms refers to it now as the overview effect's more intense manifestation, a version of the cognitive shift that occurs not when the Earth is large enough to look like a planet, but when it is small enough to look like something you could lose. The specific psychological mechanism that researchers believe produces the more intense response at lunar distance involves what cognitive scientists call the scale shift effect. Human beings have a cognitive system specifically dedicated to processing social and emotional significance of objects and people in their environment. This system, sometimes called the salience network in neuroscience literature, assigns emotional weight to objects based on their size, proximity, familiarity, and relationship to the self. At low Earth orbit, the Earth is large, close, familiar, and obviously related to the self. The salience network processes it as enormously significant, and the emotional response is correspondingly intense in a positive direction. At lunar distance, the Earth is small, distant, and visually similar to thousands of other objects visible in the same field of view. The salience network has no protocol for correctly weighting an object that the intellectual mind knows to be the most significant thing in existence, but that the visual system reports as a dim point of light smaller than the astronaut's thumbnail. The resulting cognitive dissonance between the intellectual knowledge of what the point of light is and the visual system's report of what it looks like produces a stress response that researchers have documented in the debriefs of astronauts returning from deep space missions, and that the psychological preparation protocols for extended deep space missions specifically address. The Artemis